All right, well, I have a friend who was very concerned about the spiritual condition of his two aunts. He said that both of his aunts had been raised in church and they had been faithful churchgoers even most of their adult lives too, but then he said that their mother passed away after a short illness, and instead of the death of their mom drawing these two women closer to God, instead it seemed to kind of push them further and further away. They were both angry that God had ignored their prayers to heal their mom. And before long, both of them vowed to never darken the door of a church again because, if that's the way God's going to treat us, then we want nothing to do with him. Now, I will tell you that I sympathize with my friend's two aunts. And I have to say, though, that their reaction to their mother's death is really unreasonable, isn't it? It's unreasonable. It shows that their faith in God never was what it should have been, because the Bible makes it very clear that we are all, every one of us, is appointed a day to die. Physical death is inevitable, and every prayer to spare a person from death is at best answered only temporarily. Isn't that true? God may give a person a little bit more time, but in the end, death will come simply because death is a part of life on this fallen planet. That's why I think it's important that every Christian, everyone here, have a clear understanding of death and suffering. We should never be surprised by these realities because we will endure suffering and we will walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We should not be fearful of these truths. Instead, we should learn about them and see how God can prepare us for them. This week I was listening to a sermon that talked about how our Christian faith often develops when we suffer. And I think that is so true, because some of the most mature Christians that I know are the ones who have suffered, and many of them have suffered greatly. Okay, so today we continue in our sermon series through the book of Genesis. We are now going through the life of Joseph, and so far we have learned that Joseph has gone through, kind of one trial after another. First, a few weeks ago, we learned that Joseph was hated by his brothers. Remember how they wanted to kill him, but then they kind of changed their minds. Instead, they threw their teenage brother into a pit before selling him into slavery. And then we learned that instead of getting bitter, Joseph decided to become the best slave that he could be, because if you can't get out of it, get into it. And so he was promoted to the most prominent position in Potiphar's house. And just when things were starting to look up, Potiphar's wife attempted to seduce Joseph, and when she failed, she became angry, and then she accused Joseph of trying to assault her, and so then Joseph was wrongfully thrown into this prison, and that is where we left our story last week. And so Joseph is again in a pit, so to speak, a prison dungeon, and we need to understand that at this time in this culture, there was no hope for parole. There was no trial. There was no release date. Joseph had been sent to this prison to die. The book of Psalms, chapter 105, verse 18, describes Joseph's plight. It says, "They bruised Joseph's feet with shackles, and his neck was put in irons." And so, if anyone would have a reason to be discouraged or depressed, it was Joseph. And I don't know about you, but if it were me and I had been thrown into a prison for a crime I did not commit, I think I would be tempted to struggle with maybe a little bit of bitterness, maybe some depression. But there's no evidence that Joseph ever became bitter or angry or depressed at all. It seems that he never wallowed or, put on his pity pants. Unlike many people today, Joseph never would have turned to drugs or to alcohol or to pornography or to any other sin in an attempt to kind of mentally escape his troubles. Instead, Joseph remained faithful to God. We read in Genesis chapter 39, verses 20 through 21, that while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And so, once again, Joseph is favored. You know, he's given authority over the entire prison. And so that means that Joseph has now been the favorite son. He has been the favorite slave, and now he is the favorite prisoner. So no matter how Joseph fell, no matter how low he went, he seemed to rise. We read in Genesis chapter 39, verse 23, that the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. And again, you know, just to be clear, Joseph did not deserve to be in the dungeon, but I think he handled it beautifully. And I guess that's really the inspiring part of Joseph's story, isn't it? The consistent faithfulness to God, regardless of his situation. And that consistency showed in the way that he treated people, even when he was suffering in prison. Okay, so let's pick the story up in Genesis chapter 40, verses 1 through 3. It says, sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Now, a cupbearer was the person who tasted the food and the wine of the king before the king would eat or drink it. And so if it was poisoned, you know, it would be so long cupbearer, but long live Pharaoh. And so this was a trusted position. And if that trust was ever broken, you can bet that there would be some very serious consequences. But the Bible doesn't tell us what landed these two men in prison. Verses 5 through 7 say, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected or discouraged. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad? Now, isn't it interesting, really, that Joseph would ask, you know, why do you look so sad? You know, I think this simple act of kindness really reveals Joseph's character. He cared about people. You know, we would be reading a completely different story if Joseph did not care about people, or if he had been a whiner, or if he had been a complainer, or if he had a desire for revenge. Instead, Joseph continued to just kind of work hard, and he did so with a sensitivity that reached out to other people who were also suffering. And I think that is very impressive. And I think it also shows that when your heart is right, that it is really remarkable the amount of compassion that we can show to other people. So you have the cupbearer and you have the baker. They both had these dreams, and they realize that they have some sort of significant meaning, but they don't understand what they mean. They need an interpreter. And they don't know really who they're talking to, but you remember, right? Joseph was a dreamer, and God reveals to him the meaning of dreams. And so Joseph said to these two, only God can interpret dreams, but tell me yours. And then in verses 9 through 11, the cupbearer says, in my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. And so his dream might have looked like this. But what in the world does that mean? Well, then Joseph says, starting in verse 12, this is what it means. Joseph said to him, the 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. Okay, so at this point, Joseph kind of starts networking because he knows that very few people are closer to Pharaoh than the cupbearer. And so he says in verse 14, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." Now, I can just kind of picture the baker standing there, and he must have been thinking, wow, that's great. Maybe I'm going to get some good news too about my dream. So he shares his dream with Joseph. Verse 16, he says, "On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top bread were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." What does my dream mean? Well, here's a picture of what his dream might have looked like. And when he goes to tell him what it meant, I can kind of picture Joseph getting kind of sick to his stomach, maybe turning a little pale, because it is not good news. Has anyone here ever had to deliver horrible, horrible bad news? Yeah, it's not easy. It was very difficult, but Joseph told the baker the truth when he interpreted his dream. He said to him, "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now, I don't know about you, but I think I probably would have been tempted to maybe lie. or no, I would at least stall and be like, well, but that's a really tough dream. It's going to take me 3 or 4 days to figure that one out. But Joseph, he told the truth. And that was a hard thing for him to do, but that was really the kind thing for him to do, because anyone facing death should be told the truth so that they can, get their life together, so that they can have some time to get right with God. That's important. Of course, things happened just as Joseph had said they would. The baker was executed, and the cupbearer returned to his old job as one of Pharaoh's, most trusted men. And at this point, Joseph must have thought, hey, this is my chance. The cupbearer's getting out of here. He's going to be having Pharaoh's ear again, and so he's going to do something to get me out of here. But then Genesis 40, verse 23 says, "The cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." Forgot him. And so this is where we will leave Joseph this week. He's still in prison for a crime that he did not commit. Now, when I was reading these chapters this week, I saw that there were several things that we can learn from this portion of Joseph's story, but I wanted to focus on just a few. And the first is this: suffering is inevitable. It's inevitable. It is. And it's kind of funny how unbelievers and atheists, they think they kind of have the gotcha question when they ask, well, why is there so much suffering in the world? And I just want to say to them, crack open the Bible and you will read that God addresses nearly every aspect of suffering in nearly every book of the Bible. God does not try to get around the issue of suffering, but instead he addresses it head on, starting in the book of Genesis that describes how sin, suffering, and death entered into this world. Then we have the book of Exodus that tells how the children of Israel suffered in the wilderness for 40 years. Then the book of Job and Ecclesiastes are books almost totally devoted to the theme of suffering. The book of Psalms is full of songs about suffering. The prophet Jeremiah wrote his book during one of Israel's darkest times. The book of Lamentations is the prophet weeping over the city that he is watching fall before his very eyes. The prophet Habakkuk complains because there is so much evil and suffering in the world, and God says, you think it's bad now? The suffering's about to get worse. Then in the New Testament, books like Hebrews and 1 Peter are written with the express purpose to help us to face trials and suffering. And then above all, the main subject of our Holy Bible is who? Jesus Christ, who the Bible calls a man of sorrows, who is acquainted with many griefs. He's a suffering servant. And so the Bible, from cover to cover is about how God works in suffering. And of course, the good news is how he solves suffering. And that's why I think it's kind of ridiculous when people, especially people in the church, cross their arms and say, well, but what about all the suffering in the world? It's like, are you not paying attention? Jesus died for that sin and suffering, and that is the main message of the entire Bible. A second thing we learn from this story of Joseph is that God puts us through trials to refine us and to prepare us for more. James 1, verses 2 through 4 say, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Now notice that it says the testing of your faith produces perseverance. This is a test, the Bible says. Trials and suffering are often testing our faith. A few times in the Bible, there is this illustration of a metallist, somebody who works with metal, testing metal or purifying it. When the Bible says that God is testing us, it sometimes uses the metallurgic term for refining precious metal. That's why Proverbs 17, verse 3, and this is the New Living Translation, it says, fire tests the purity of silver and gold, but the Lord tests the heart. And how do you purify metal? How do you purify metal? You heat it up. You heat it up. And the dross, it's called the dross, or the impurities, will rise to the top, and then the impurities or the dross is scraped away. This is called testing the metal, purifying it. And I'm just curious, can anyone here relate to that process? Can anyone here relate to that process? Sean doesn't just have his hand up, he's got both hands up and he's waving them. You ever been put through the refiner's fire? Yeah, I would say most of us have. Has anyone here gone through suffering or a trial that revealed the dross or the impurities in your life? I have. And it's so painful as that dross, kind of rises to the top. But then it's so good when God scrapes it away. And I bet that if most Christ followers in this room reflected for just a minute, we would see that it was our suffering that changed us maybe more than anything else, because it removes the most impurities. God sometimes uses our deepest pain to do some of the greatest good in this world. But in order to get to that place, you have to look beyond your own circumstances. You have to look beyond yourself. When life gets really hard, it's tempting to get mad and then repeatedly ask God, why me? Why me? But there comes a point when we got to stop asking the question, why me? And start asking God, what's next? Stop asking why me and start asking, what now? What now? What do you want me to do now, God? What is it that you have tested and prepared me for? In Joseph's case, we learn that God is preparing Joseph to become the second highest ranking official in all the land, in all of Egypt, who will save most of the world from a famine. And so God is refining him for that mission. But boy, this can be a really tough question. But do we ever stop to think why God might be refining us? Do we ever stop to think about that? What could be the reason for our trial? What could be the purpose of our pain? Those are some of the most difficult questions to answer, but they are worth asking, because it could be that God is preparing you for something very important, a greater mission. I read this week about a little boy who had a very sharp mind. He was very smart, but he had a terrible birthmark on his face. His face was actually disfigured by this birthmark. His mother tried to, give him as much self-esteem as she could, but then there came a day when he went off to first grade, and when he got home, her worst fears were realized because he came through the door bursting into tears and said, "Mom, all the kids made fun of my birthmark. I'm not going to go back to that school. I cannot go back." And his mom said, "Son, you have to go back. You have to learn. That's your responsibility." And years later, Dr. Charles Eliot stepped down as president of Harvard University, and he said that all of the education he had and all the experiences that he had did not equal the one thing that his mother taught him when he was 6 years old. When she said, "Son, there are some things you cannot change, so there's no use crying about it. There's no use complaining about it. You cannot change them. You have to accept it and move on. Your suffering may be toughening you. It might be toughening you for something bigger, for a greater mission." A third lesson from the story of Joseph is that suffering or testing tells us who we are. In both the Old and New Testaments, the word translated test means to prove by trial. And so when God tests his children, his purpose is to prove that our faith is real. And we need to understand that his testing is not so God can be convinced that our faith is real, because he is all-knowing. He already knows if Chris Burke's faith is real or not. He already knows if Gary Woods' faith is real or not. He already knows if Matt Hammond's faith is real or not, because he knows everything. Luke 12, verse 7 indicates that God knows the number of hairs on our heads. And so God does not test us to see what we're made of. He already knows. Instead, we are being tested so that we can see what we're made of. The true faith of Joseph was revealed during the trials he endured, and that is true for us too. Again, James 1:3 says the testing of your faith produces patience or perseverance. So notice that what is being tested is our faith. Suffering reveals who we really are. It separates the sheep from the goats and the wheat from the tares, or the unbelievers from the believers. Matthew 7:20 says, "By their fruits you will know them." And one of the fruits of genuine believers is that we will endure hardship and suffering. Jesus said in Matthew 10:22 that he who endures to the end will be saved. And so defection is evidence of a false conversion. If you defect from the faith, that's evidence of a false conversion. You're probably never a Christian in the first place. John said in 1 John 2:19, "They went out from us, but they were not really of us. For if they had been of us, they would have remained with us." In other words, when the suffering came and the refiner's fire, kind of heated up, turned up, unbelievers will give up on Christ. Things get hard. There comes a little bit of persecution. Being a Christian is no longer cool. And we'll kind of look around one day and say, "Where'd they go? Where'd they go?" Well, they left us because they were never really one of us. And their suffering revealed that. A fourth lesson that we learn from this story is that our suffering should never stop us from caring for other people. In fact, sometimes it is the caring for someone else that can snap us out of a depression. I read one time about a seminary professor who fell into this really deep depression, and it was so deep that he didn't care about anyone or anything. Everything was dark and hopeless. And then one day, a friend urged him to, step out of yourself and write a thank you letter to someone who has helped you at some point in your life, and then send it to that person. And the person that came to this professor's mind was his old grade school teacher who had instilled in him the love of literature. And so he wrote her a letter of gratitude. And then, a couple days later, he received a reply back, kind of in this shaky handwriting from that elderly teacher that said, "Dear William, When I read your letter, I was blinded by tears, for I remember you as a little fella in my class. You have warmed my old heart. I taught school for 50 years, and yours is the first letter of thanks I have ever received from a student. I will cherish it until I die. And with that letter, this seminary professor said that, kind of a sliver of light came into my life. And so he decided that he was going to write another note of gratitude. And so he did. And then he wrote another and another and another until he had written 500 letters of thanks. And guess what happened? His depression was cured. No more depression. 2 Corinthians 1:4 says, God comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others, to give them the same comfort that God has given to us. Joseph maintained his trust in God and ministered to other people despite his circumstances, and we can do that too. Okay, so lastly, suffering reminds us that this world is not our home. Aren't you grateful that this world is not our home? We're here for a little bit and then we're gone. The book of Ecclesiastes says that our life is a vapor. And the older I get, the more I recognize that to be so true. It just goes so fast. We're here and then we're gone. Romans 8:18 says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. And so in other words, there is no comparison between our current hard times with the coming good times. There's no comparison. And the longer we live as Christians, the more attraction heaven should have for us. Vance Havner was an old Baptist preacher who said, I am homesick for heaven, and it is the hope of dying that has kept me alive for so long. And I do think that's kind of funny, but I get what he's saying, because the hope of heaven is really what makes it possible for us to endure suffering. Isn't that true? And I don't know about you, but I know that this place ain't my home. It's not. And so I don't expect this world to be too great, because it is a fallen planet. It's polluted. There's toxins all around us. And we can let that make us paranoid. Well, there's things out there that could kill us. But we should never, ever let those things steal our joy. And did you also know that I don't expect the people of this world to meet all of my needs? You know why? Because we're all fallen creatures, and you're not really capable of doing that. You cannot meet my needs. I don't expect you to. But I think that there are people who just kind of, they live in a state of fear and disappointment because they expect too much of this place, don't they? This is not heaven. It's not. But we do need to use our time here to prepare for heaven. And we do that by putting our trust in Jesus Christ. I was talking to Becky Hammond this week, and I was so impressed by her that she actually took the time to write out what she would say to someone when sharing the gospel, the good news with someone. And she said, I'm going to start off by telling them the bad news, that our sin separates us from God, and we all sin, and we all fall short of the glory of God. And then, she moves on to some more points, like, Jesus dying to pay the price for our sin, that his blood was shed to cover our sin. And then she's got verses to, back all that up. And then she shares the good news, which is, if we put our trust in Jesus Christ, we will be saved. And I really love, though, what she says at the end of her gospel presentation, which is this. She says, there's no plan B. There is no plan B. There's no other way to God or to heaven. Jesus is the narrow gate that we must all pass through. He is our only hope. Let's stand and we're going to pray. Father, again, we thank you for the life of Joseph and the many lessons that we learn about all sorts of things, including suffering. And Lord, while we know that suffering is inevitable, we are thankful that it is also temporary for those who have put their trust in Jesus Christ, your Son. And so, Lord, I pray for anyone here who has maybe been on the verge of surrendering to Jesus, maybe for a long time, but they just keep delaying for some reason that I do not understand. And so I just pray, Father, that you would just clearly show them who you are, clearly show them that they have a need for you, because it's the only way. There's no plan B. Jesus is the narrow gate that we must all pass through. And so, Lord, I pray that whoever needs to make that decision today would make it. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'll be right down front, just like always, if anybody would like to pray this morning.